Now that we've gathered up our fabric, we're just about ready to pin it to the smaller section of fabric that we prepared earlier. But first, as you can see, some of the fullness here is a little poofy, and I'm a little concerned that it could get caught up in the seam line and make funny little puckers instead of nice, neat drapes of cloth. So what you want to do is hold your fabric at the top where the gathering stitches are and then tug on it from the bottom just to straighten out those gathers to help them to lay more vertically. Now take your piece, and remember we made that mark in the center there? We want to line up that mark right sides together with the mark that we made on the front of the gathered section here. And once we have those markings lined up, we're going to pin from the side of the gathers. All right, now we have that centered on that mark. Now what we want to do is line up any other important parts. In this case, because it's just a short section, we're going to line up the side edges. If you're working with a skirt on, that you're attaching to a bodice, you might also want to line up any seam lines that help to spread out the gathered sections evenly. As you can see here, I drew up the gathers more than I needed. You can see I have extra fabric here. Now what I'm going to do is just kind of pull on that to get the flat fabric to lay flat. So now I know I have the proper length on both sides. Now, so the thread doesn't come loose, I'm going to wrap it around the end pin in a figure 8 just to keep that snug. And we're going to do that on both sides. That way some of the gathers don't come undone while we're working. Now you can see here, right now our gathers are kind of centered on that pin, and we want to spread them out over these sections. So just use your fingernail and just kind of brush your gathers across until they're evenly spread, and then pin in place. Be generous with your pinning, because that'll help keep the gathers secure so they don't shift around while you're sewing. And then do the same for the other side. Make sure you keep the top edges lined up there. And there you have it pinned. Now the next thing we need to do is sew the final seam line. Before you sew your final seam on your gathered section, make sure you have the right thread in the upper and bobbin thread, and you've reset your stitch length and the upper tension to its original settings if you change those at all. Now we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and we're going to start at the beginning. Always make sure you backstitch to anchor that beginning stitch, and just stitch using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Be sure you take the pins out as you go, because you don't want to run over a pin. That's a sure way to break a needle. If you find some of the gathers tend to bunch up and shift as you sew, just watch them as you go and just take a needle and readjust them if necessary. There you go. One of the most important steps after sewing any seam is taking the time to press, and a gathered section is no exception. The first thing we need to do is set our seam to help define that seam line. We'll do that by pulling the gathers down and pressing right up to the gathers. Give it some steam if you want to help set that seam. And then you need to determine what kind of fullness you want here. Do you want your gathers to be held out to be full and loose, or do you want your gathers to drape down and hang neatly? For a more full and loose gather, we want to turn your project over and sew from the bottom up to the gathers, being careful not to make any creases along those soft folds, because you really want to keep the folds of your gathers nice and soft. So just keep pressing, give it a little steam when necessary, and just press up toward those gathers until you get it the way you want. For more fullness, try to cup those gathers a little bit as you work, and that'll help them to stand out a little bit. And see how that looks, how it's fluffed up. Now, sometimes you may prefer that your gathers drape down more and don't stick out. And what you can do, especially on the smaller scale, is force it to do that. First, you can just pull down on the gathers by holding the top and pulling from the bottom. But if the fullness is still a little too much for whatever it is you're making, start at the top, give it a good amount of steam, and just gently, you're not going to press really hard, but gently push down and give some steam to your gathers. You don't necessarily want to make a crease, but you want to force them to lay down. And then, again, keep pulling that down, steam, and shape your gathers the way you want them. And that way, they're going to hang more flat